How does a heart know when it has found a sanctuary, not just a shelter? Abigail trudged up the last rise, the worn leather of her boots scraping against loose shale. The wind, a constant thief on the high plains, stole the warmth from her shawl and bit at the tears freezing on her cheeks. Beside her, his great head low, paced the dog. He was a shadow of muscle and grief, a German shepherd named Ghost who had not wagged his tail since the day his master had been lowered into the earth and the truth of his life had clawed its way into the light. She was not just running from the memory of a husband lost, but from the shame of a life that had been a lie. The weight in her belly, a round, hard promise of the future, was the only thing that felt real, the only thing that drove her feet forward when all she wanted was to lie down and let the prairie grass claim her. Then she saw it. Tucked into a fold of the hills, sheltered by a small stand of weathered cottonwoods, was a cabin. It was small, abandoned, with a stone chimney that listed like a tired old man. It wasn't a home. But it was a place to stop running. As dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the vast, indifferent sky, she pushed open the door, which groaned on its one good hinge. The air inside was thick with the scent of dust, disuse, and the faint, lingering smell of wood smoke, a ghost of warmth from a winter long past. Ghost stepped inside first, his claws clicking on the rough-hewn floorboards, and for the first time in weeks, he stopped his ceaseless pacing. He stood in the center of the single room, his body rigid, and let out a long, slow breath. Abigail sagged against the doorframe, her hand resting on the swell of her stomach. The cabin was an empty shell, but it had 4 walls and a roof. It was enough. For now, it was everything. The first night was a battle against the cold and the silence. Abigail found a crumbling stack of firewood beside the hearth, damp and smelling of moss, but with patient effort, she coaxed a small, smoky fire to life. The meager flames threw dancing shadows across the walls, making the small space feel both intimate and profoundly lonely. She explored her new domain by its flickering light. There was a crude table, a single chair with a weakened leg, and a bed frame laced with broken ropes. In a small cupboard, she found a tin cup and a bent fork. Nothing more. It was a place stripped bare of history, which suited the emptiness inside her. She sat on the floor, her back against the rough stones of the fireplace, and pulled her shawl tighter. Ghost refused to settle near her or the fire. He lay by the door, his nose pressed to the crack at the floor, a stoic sentinel guarding against a world that had already broken in and taken everything. He would not eat the piece of jerky she offered from her hand, only taking it from the floor when he thought she was not looking. He was mourning. She understood the language of his grief because it was her own. It was a patient, hollow sorrow that asked for nothing and expected less. Her husband, Robert, had been a man of easy laughter and grand promises. The dog had adored him. Abigail had built her world around him. And then he was gone, a fever taking him in 3 short days. The grief was a clean, sharp wound until the banker arrived with the ledgers, the letters, the proof of a second life in a town 200 miles away, a life of debt and deceit that had left her with nothing but the child she carried and the loyal, heartbroken animal at her side. The betrayal was a dirtier wound, one that festered. She had not been grieving a man, she had been grieving a fiction. The wind howled a mournful song around the corners of the cabin, and Abigail closed her eyes, listening. The sound was no longer a threat. It was a lullaby for all the lost and broken things. As the days bled into one another, a fragile routine took root in the forgotten cabin. Mornings began with the chill of the prairie seeping through the chinks in the walls, a raw reminder of her solitude. Abigail would coax the fire back to life, her movement slow and deliberate, conserving the small store of energy she had. She spent hours patching the worst of the holes in the roof with mud and dried grass, her hands raw but her mind blessedly focused on the simple, physical task. The landscape outside was a constant presence. The plains rolled away in every direction, a sea of muted greens and golds under a sky so vast it seemed to hold all the world's silence. The mountains stood like distant, sleeping giants, their peaks shrouded in morning mist. The sheer, empty scale of it all should have been terrifying, but instead, it was a comfort. Out here, her small, sharp pain felt properly sized, a single note in an immense and ancient song. Her only companion remained a study in stillness. Ghost rarely moved from his post by the door, his amber eyes fixed on the horizon as if expecting Robert to ride into view at any moment. Abigail spoke to him, her voice soft in the quiet room, telling him about the baby, about the ache in her back, about the way the light changed at dusk. He never responded, never turned his head, but she felt he was listening. He was a vessel for the grief she could not always afford to feel herself. The child inside her was a constant, rolling presence, a reminder that life demanded to move forward, even when the heart wanted to stand still. She would rest her hands on her belly and feel the flutter of a foot or an elbow, a secret conversation that belonged only to her. In the profound quiet of the wilderness, she was beginning to distinguish the shape of her own thoughts from the echoes of Robert's lies. She was alone, but she was no longer adrift. She had found a small, hard piece of ground on which to stand. He appeared as a silhouette on the third day, a man on horseback moving along the distant ridge line. Abigail saw him from the cabin's single grimy window and her heart seized, a cold knot of fear. She froze, her hand instinctively going to the small knife at her belt. Ghost was on his feet in an instant, a low, rumbling growl starting deep in his chest. But the man did not approach. He stopped his horse, a tall, dark shape against the pale sky, and seemed to be studying the thin curl of smoke rising from her chimney. He was too far away to make out any features, but his stillness felt watchful, not aggressive. After a long moment, he turned his horse and rode away, disappearing over the rise. The encounter left Abigail shaken, the fragile piece of her sanctuary shattered. She spent the rest of the day on edge, watching the horizon, Ghost's growls a constant, low hum beside her. The next morning, she saw him again. This time he rode closer, dismounting at the edge of the cottonwood grove, about 100 yards from the cabin. She watched, her breath held tight in her chest, as he untied a burlap sack from his saddle. He walked to a large, flat-topped rock that marked the edge of the clearing, placed the sack upon it, and then, without a single glance toward the cabin, he mounted his horse and rode off. For hours, the sack sat on the rock, an offering and a question. Hunger warred with suspicion. It was Ghost who finally broke the stalemate. He whined, a high, thin sound of need, and nudged her hand with his nose. Slowly, cautiously, she opened the door and walked to the rock, the dog at her heels. Inside the sack, she found a small bag of flour, a block of salt pork, a handful of dried apples, and a pouch of coffee. There was no note, no sign of who had left it. It was an act of charity so stark and anonymous it felt less like kindness and more like a simple statement of fact. You are here, you are in need, here is sustenance. She carried the provisions back to the cabin, her mind reeling. The man knew she was here. He was not driving her away. He was helping her survive. The silent offerings became a new part of her routine. Every 2 or 3 days, the man would appear on the ridge. He never varied his approach. He would leave a bundle on the rock and depart. Sometimes it was food, a brace of rabbits, a string of fish, a bag of potatoes. One morning, she awoke to find a neat stack of freshly cut and split firewood piled against the cabin's outer wall, enough to last for weeks. Another time, she noticed the broken pane in the window had been replaced with a carefully fitted piece of oiled canvas that kept the wind at bay. He did these things while she slept or when she was inside, a phantom carpenter, a faceless provider. His consideration was so profound it was unnerving. He was tending to her survival without ever imposing his presence. The quiet, consistent care was a language she had forgotten how to hear. It asked for nothing. It demanded no gratitude. It simply was. Ghost's reaction to the man was her barometer. The deep, threatening growls slowly subsided into low rumbles of suspicion. He would still stand stiffly at the door when the horseman appeared, but his hackles no longer rose. He would watch the man leave the supplies and then look to Abigail, a question in his intelligent eyes. She began to feel a strange sense of ownership over the quiet ritual, a connection to the man she had never spoken to. She started leaving the tin cup on the rock as a silent thank you, and in the morning, she would find it back on her doorstep, rinsed clean. It was a conversation without words, a bond forged in the vast, empty space between the cabin and the ridge. One afternoon, as she sat outside mending a tear in her dress, she saw him stop his horse and look toward her. For a long moment, they simply held each other's gaze across the distance. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and rode away. In that small gesture, she felt a flicker of warmth, a recognition of her existence that was not tied to pity or obligation. It was the beginning of trust, fragile as a spider's thread in the wind. A sudden cold front swept down from the mountains, bringing with it a thick, chilling fog that clung to the land like a shroud. The world shrank to the small clearing around the cabin, the cottonwoods becoming ghostly shapes in the grey mist. The damp cold seeped into Abigail's bones and made the small fire sputter and hiss. She was checking her dwindling woodpile when he emerged from the fog, not on horseback this time, but on foot. He was closer than he had ever been, standing just at the edge of the trees, a tall, broad-shouldered man in a heavy sheepskin coat. Ghost let out a single, low woof but did not move from his spot on the porch. The man carried an axe in one hand. He looked from her to the small pile of wood, then at the chimney where the smoke struggled against the heavy air. "That wood's too green. It won't burn hot in this damp," he said. His voice was low and steady, like the rumble of distant thunder. It was the first time she had heard it. Abigail clutched her shawl, her heart beating a little faster. She could only nod. "You'll need more for this," he said, gesturing to the oppressive fog. It's settling in. He didn't wait for an answer. He walked past her, his gaze briefly flicking to her rounded belly, a flicker of understanding in his eyes before he looked away, granting her the privacy of her condition. He went to a fallen tree at the edge of the clearing and began to work. The rhythmic thud of the axe was a solid, reassuring sound in the muffled world. He worked with an economy of motion, splitting logs with clean, powerful strokes. He was a man defined by what he did. Abigail stood and watched, feeling a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. When he had cut a substantial pile, he stacked it neatly near the door. He turned to leave, his face still mostly shadowed by his hat. "Thank you," she said, her own voice sounding small and unused. He paused. "My name is Thomas," he said to the fog, and then he was gone, swallowed by the grey as silently as he had appeared. The fog lifted after 2 days, leaving behind a world washed clean and sharp in the autumn light. Thomas's visits changed after that. He still left supplies, but now he would sometimes linger, leaning against the fence he had mended, and they would talk. The conversations were sparse, fragments of observation about the weather, the deer moving down from the high country, the way the seasons were turning. He never asked where she had come from or why she was alone. He seemed to accept her presence as he accepted the hawks that circled overhead, as a part of the landscape. Through these small exchanges, she pieced together the shape of his life. He owned the land, a ranch that stretched for miles, inherited from his father. He lived alone in the main house, a 2-day ride to the east. This small cabin was a forgotten line shack, unused for years. He spoke of his work with a quiet, grounding passion, of mending fences, of tending to his small herd of cattle, of the endless, cyclical work of the land. His life was one of patient, steady effort, and she found herself envying its simplicity, its honesty. One afternoon he knelt, his movement slow and unthreatening, and held out his bare hand to Ghost. The dog, who had been watching him with a wary curiosity for weeks, hesitated. He took a tentative step forward, sniffed the offered hand, and then, after a long, still moment, he extended his tongue and gave a single, soft lick. Thomas did not move, simply allowing the contact. He looked up at Abigail, and a small, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. "He's a good dog," he said. Just sad seeing the dog's small act of trust, Abigail felt a corresponding shift within herself. The ice that had encased her heart for so long developed a hairline crack. That evening, for the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a small future, one that extended beyond just surviving the next day. She imagined seeing the winter through in this small, quiet place. She imagined her baby being born not into a world of fear and flight, but into one of stillness and safety. The pains began just after dusk, low and deep in her back. At first, she dismissed them as the familiar aches of late pregnancy, but they soon began to come with a tightening, rhythmic intensity that stole her breath. A fierce, unseasonable storm had blown in, and rain lashed against the cabin, driven by a wind that shrieked and clawed at the roof. She was alone. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow. Thomas was miles away, at his own home. No one in the world knew she was here, in this fragile shelter, her body beginning the terrifying, inexorable work of birth. Panic, cold and sharp, rose in her throat. The fire in the hearth sputtered as a gust of wind drove rain down the chimney. Ghost, sensing her distress, came to her side, whining and nudging her hand with his wet nose. He was no longer a symbol of grief, but a warm, living anchor in a sea of fear. The pains grew stronger, closer. She cried out, the sound swallowed by the roar of the storm. She was losing time. She needed help. She crawled to the door, her body trembling with effort and pain, and pushed it open. The wind and rain tore at her, soaking her thin nightdress in seconds. She didn't know what she planned to do, scream, light a signal, but she had to do something. And then, through the deluge, she saw it, a light. A single lantern, swinging and bobbing, moving steadily toward the cabin. It was Thomas. Whether drawn by some premonition, a sixth sense for the land and its occupants, or simply because he had seen her chimney smoke falter, he was coming. He reached the cabin, his face grim and soaked, his eyes wide with concern as he took in her state. He didn't ask. He didn't hesitate. He swept her up into his strong arms as another contraction seized her, and carried her back inside, kicking the door shut against the raging storm. The cabin became a small island of intense focus in the roaring chaos of the storm. Thomas moved with a quiet, reassuring competence that sliced through Abigail's terror. He stoked the fire until it blazed, filling the room with warmth and steady light. He tore strips from a clean shirt he found in his saddlebags and boiled water on the hearth. His hands were large and calloused from work, but his touch was surprisingly gentle as he wiped her brow with a cool, damp cloth. "Breathe," he said, his voice a low, calm anchor. "Just breathe with me." He spoke to her throughout the long hours, not with empty platitudes, but with simple, direct instructions. He told her she was strong. He told her the baby was coming. He made her believe it. In the raw, elemental crucible of childbirth, all pretense was stripped away. He was not a stranger, and she was not a fugitive. They were two people bound together in a moment of life and death. His presence was a solid wall she could brace herself against. When the final, overwhelming urge came, she gripped his hand, her nails digging into his flesh, and he held fast, absorbing her pain, his face a mask of fierce concentration. As the storm outside began to lose its fury, a new sound filled the small cabin, the thin, startling cry of a newborn baby. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated life. Dawn was breaking, and pale, watery light filtered through the window, illuminating the scene. Thomas, his face etched with exhaustion and awe, carefully wrapped the small, squirming body in a clean blanket and placed him in Abigail's waiting arms. It was a boy. He had a shock of dark hair and his father's eyes, but she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, that he would be his own man. Ghost, who had been a silent witness in the corner, came forward and gently, so gently, nudged the bundle with his nose, his tail giving a single, tentative wag. Weeks passed. The raw edge of autumn softened into the quiet stillness of late fall. The cabin was no longer a refuge, it was a home. The small, demanding presence of the baby, whom Abigail had named Samuel, had filled every corner with a new sense of purpose. The air smelled of milk, clean linen, and wood smoke. Thomas was a part of its rhythm. He came every day, his visits no longer governed by the need to leave supplies but by a quiet desire to be there. He would hold the baby with a surprising tenderness, his large, rough hands looking impossibly gentle against Samuel's tiny form. He never crowded her, never presumed, but his presence was a constant, steady warmth. He fixed the broken chair, built a sturdy cradle from spare lumber, and sat with her in the evenings by the fire, the silence between them as comfortable as conversation. One night, with Samuel sleeping peacefully in his cradle and Ghost dozing at their feet, Abigail found the words she had been holding for so long. She told him everything. She spoke of Robert, of the life she thought she had, and the crushing weight of the betrayal that had sent her fleeing into the wilderness. She spoke of the shame and the fear, her voice low and even, the pain described with a restraint that gave it a terrible weight. Thomas listened, his gaze fixed on the flames. He did not interrupt, did not offer judgment or pity. He simply listened, granting her story the dignity of being heard. When she finally fell silent, the only sound was the crackle of the fire. He reached across the small space between them and gently placed his hand over hers where it rested on the table. It was the first time he had touched her with such clear intent. It was not a touch of comfort or passion, but of recognition. A quiet acknowledgement of a shared wound, a parallel abandonment she could sense in his own deep stillness. In that simple, earned contact, a new story began. It was not a grand romance, but something quieter, stronger. It was the story of a small, earned future, taking root in the wilderness, nurtured by quiet acts of kindness, and guarded by a sad dog who was finally learning to be happy.